In this movie, we're going to look at the overall system-wide options that Revit has available to us. Now, I should point out that most of these options will probably be set by some sort of a CAD or BIM manager if you work in a firm. And most of the time, these settings are what I would term set it and forget it options. So once they've been configured to your liking, you rarely have to change them unless there's some change in circumstance that requires it. So these settings are not stored with each project. In other words, they're stored with the Revit environment. And so they follow from project to project. Now, I don't actually have any projects open right now, and it's not necessary to open a project to get to the options. You can access them without anything open on screen. The first option I'm going to look at is how I'm signed in. So at the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can see that there's several icons, and one of them has the sign in option. That's right here. And you can see that that's labeled Autodesk 360. Now, if you have an Autodesk 360 account, then you can set up a username and a password, and you can log in directly from the Revit software. If I switch over here to my Windows Start menu, notice that my username is just my name right here, Paul Aubin. Okay. Now I'm going to switch back to Revit. If I go to the application menu, we can get to the global options here at the bottom of the application menu using this button right here, options. So here on the very first tab in general, you could see the username area, and you can see that it's using that same name that I had back in Windows. Now that's just the default behavior that Revit will do, is it will use your Windows login if you haven't signed in to Autodesk 360. But notice that there is a sign in to Autodesk 360 here. And if I choose this, I'm able to put in my Autodesk 360 username and password, sign in. And what'll happen is Revit will display a message here saying that my Revit username is going to be changed to match that. And so when I click close here, notice that it grays out my username and it matches my Autodesk 360 username. So it's important to understand that if you've logged in to your Autodesk 360 account, it's going to use that as your username. Now, normally this is not going to be that big of an issue, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, where the username is actually used in Revit is when you're in a team project. Now, I'm going to talk about how to open up a team project in a future movie, but if you're working in a standalone project, you don't really care what your username is. It only matters when you're working in a team of people that are accessing the same project together, and then each person has to have a unique username. And usually using a 360 username accomplishes that quite nicely. Now, directly above that, we have some notifications that have to do with saving. If you're in a team project, it will remind you every so often to synchronize with your central file. If you're in a standalone project, it will remind you every so often to save your standalone project. Now, both of these are set to a 30-minute increment by default, and I think that's a pretty good increment for most users, but you can actually change it to something less frequent or to something more frequent. It's actually possible to turn off the reminders as well, but I really don't recommend that. The way that the reminders work is that as you're working, if you haven't saved in that amount of time, then Revit will look for an opportunity to display a reminder. And it's usually a disruptive opportunity. In other words, as soon as you execute a command, it will display this interruption and say, yeah, but you haven't saved in a while. Now, while some users get frustrated by that interruption and are tempted to click the cancel button, I highly recommend that you don't do that. Get in the habit of clicking save the project. Revit will remember what you were doing when it's done saving, and it will take you right back to whatever it was you were doing. And this is your best defense against losing work if something bad should happen and the system should crash. So you need to be in the habit of saving often, and the save reminders are designed to help you do that. Now, there's some other settings here on this tab that we don't have to be concerned with at the moment, like work sharing frequency and so forth. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But down here, you've got your default view discipline. Now, a lot of times it will default to something like coordination. But if your discipline is something different, like architectural or structural, you probably want to choose that from the list. So I'm actually going to choose architectural here. The biggest benefit of doing that is when I create a new view, like a new floor plan or a new section or elevation, it'll be assigned to that architectural discipline ahead of time and therefore use appropriate settings. Now let's look at some of the other tabs here. Under user interface, depending on your version of Revit, you may have several checkboxes available here. Now, I've got the full Revit installed here. Even though I'm architectural, I have access to the structure tab and the systems tab here in the background. So if I didn't want to see those tabs, I could actually turn them off by just unchecking it here, and it would hide that tab if I don't want to see it. Now, I'm going to leave them turned on, but you could choose your own preferences there. Now, if you don't have all those checkboxes in your Revit, don't worry. It's not going to affect any of the work that we're going to do here throughout the course. You can set the theme that you want. We talked about keyboard shortcuts in the previous movie. You can get to the customization here. There's also an option here to control what happens when you double click on an element. Now, there's a lot of options here. So if I click this customize box, you can see that there's several different items that have this double click feature. Now, most of them I'm okay with the default settings, except for the very first one here, the family option. What this is saying is when you double click on a family, it's going to open up the family and edit it in the family editor. Now, I think most of the time that's probably not what you intend when you double click on a family. So I personally don't like that option. I would choose either edit type or do nothing, so that if I double click on a family, it's not going to try and do anything at all. I don't want to end up in the family editor when I wasn't expecting it. And we'll talk about the family editor in a later movie. So let's go ahead and click OK on that. We talked about tooltip assistance in a previous movie, but this controls those tooltips that appear on screen and whether they show just a brief amount of information, whether they show a detailed tooltip, or whether they do both. The default normal behavior is what we've witnessed, where it shows the short tooltip first, and then after a brief pause, it shows the more detailed one. But if you prefer the minimal all the time or the high all the time, you can choose that. Let me go to the graphics tab next. Now, depending on your graphic card and the settings and your hardware and so forth, you may see a message here that's asking you to get more information about your hardware. Talk it over with your IT people and see whether there's anything to be concerned about there. I will point out, however, here under graphics mode, that there's this option here called use hardware acceleration. Now, normally that's a good thing because it can help speed things up, especially in detailed 3D views. However, if you're noticing any kind of odd behavior on screen, if things are displaying kind of weird or you seem to see visual artifacts on screen, usually the hardware acceleration is the culprit. You can customize colors if you want to change your user interface. I'm going to leave all of these set to the defaults. One last place that I'm going to look at here is on file locations. In the background, I have the recent file screen open, and we talked about in a previous movie the different default templates that are listed here. Those are all located here. If you want, you can use this icon here to add values to that list, or this one to remove values from that list. So if I had no interest in the mechanical template, I could remove it from the list. If I wanted to add an Office standard template, I could add it to the list. And what will happen is it will customize this list that you see back here and put those templates that you want to use readily available to the users when they access the system. When you've got all of the options set to your liking, you rarely will have to come back in this dialog again. This is largely a set it and forget it kind of situation. And so you set up all the options the way you want. The first time, consult your CAD and BIM manager if you have any questions. And then for the most part, you really don't have to come back here again unless something changes that warrants it.